A boy wondered if the lady was a fairy. The lady asked which group he belonged to. The boy replied that he was Vengeance, the commander of the 3rd platoon in the 2nd company. The lady remarked that in his company, soldiers are taught to state their rank when meeting a superior. The boy apologized for his mistake. Encrid then guessed that the lady was the new commander of the 4th company. He introduced himself as the commander of the 4th squad in the 14th company in the 4th platoon. The lady mentioned that she had heard Encrid was leading his difficult squad members well and looked forward to his contributions. As she turned to leave, Encrid wondered if she had come only for that. She stopped and then asked the name of another boy, sitting there. The boy hesitated before revealing that his name was Krang. Encrid wondered if Krang was lying and noted that his attitude in front of the company commander was poor. He also wondered if Krang was a noble. The lady then left. That night, Encrid tried to move his fingers, thinking that most of the pain had subsided and that he could now focus his strength into his body. He decided he should begin training. As Encrid was putting on his shoes, a boy asked where he was going. Encrid replied that he was heading to the training area. As Encrid left, the boy called him an idiot for acting tough, being the lowest-ranking soldier. Encrid began his practice by recalling his past battles, a technique he had invested a great deal of money in learning when he was younger. He remembered the last time he was stabbed and wondered why that last-ditch attack had failed. He realized it wasn't wise to put all his eggs in one basket. If one attack fails, it could be fatal. He reflected on the lethal nature of Renzak's attacks and resolved to give his all in his training. Just then, Krang approached Encrid, mentioning that he had been working hard, but was confused by Encrid's actions. Krang noted that Encrid's hands had been twitching in the barracks and now he was out here spacing out. Encrid explained that he was training his grip strength and replicating battle scenarios. Krang asked why he was doing that. Encrid replied that it was to avoid getting caught off guard. Krang asked if Encrid intended to preserve his life in order to become something even greater. Encrid reflected on his dream of what he wanted to become. He knew that if he shared it with others, they would laugh at him. It was a dream he had been striving to fulfill despite his limited talent, a dream he had never stopped desiring to accomplish. Encrid then took out a sword and spoke about knights, mentioning that it was his first time seeing one. Krang asked what he meant. Encrid explained that he was referring to someone who didn't laugh at him. Krang stood up, saying he had just remembered something and understood what he needed to do after watching Encrid. He added that if Encrid became a knight, he should remember Krang's name as a friend. Encrid thought it was the first time he had felt supported. The next day, a boy playing an instrument asked others who the hero of the battlefield was. They mentioned Cypress. Another boy wondered why the morning rations had not arrived yet, and whether others were planning to eat all of it and serve them the scraps. Encrid, having woken up and waited for the delayed breakfast, decided to take a short walk instead of heading directly to the training area. As he was about to speak, Jackson, who was sitting nearby, asked about Encrid's injuries. Encrid replied that the medicines were working well and thanked Jackson for asking. Jackson told him that if he was truly thankful, he should hurry up and come back. That night, Krang wished Encrid good night, and they both went to sleep. A boy asked Anya what they had been talking about. Encrid thought it was a day for doing nothing. The next morning, Cypress began playing music again and asked who the hero was. The others responded by naming Cypress. Encrid woke up and wondered if the wandering minstrel had returned that day. He also wondered why the minstrel would come back when he was just a wanderer. Meanwhile, the boy continued shouting about the morning rations, asking if they were planning to serve those scraps. Encrid thought the boy's complaints were so loud and repetitive, making it feel like he was stuck in the same day. As he stepped outside, Jackson asked about Encrid's injuries again. Encrid replied that the medicine was working well and thanked him for asking. Jackson responded that if Encrid was truly grateful, he should hurry up and return. Encrid was certain it was the same day as before. He recalled the words of someone who had said that another obstacle would stand in his way, and he needed to try to survive. Encrid wondered if he had died in his sleep, facing a fate even more hopeless than when he had been stabbed. Despite this, he felt more determined. It was just another challenge. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, he thought about who and how someone might have killed him. He reasoned that the enemy would need to get past all the defenses to reach him, which would be possible only for a night. It seemed unlikely, so he considered the possibility of a hidden assassin, someone skilled in assassination, who knew the location of the medical barracks and could conceal their presence. Encrid thought of the lady with quiet, nimble feet, perfect for assassination. He speculated that her visit had been to scout the location in advance. He needed to confirm this. There was only one entrance to the medical barracks. Encrid planned to end the threat by shouting and waking up the other soldiers the moment he saw her. He would just have to wait for the assassination attempt. Then he thought of the poisonous needle that had struck his neck. He realized he hadn't even seen the assassin enter. The pain was so intense that he fell from the bed, unable to move or speak. It was a potent numbing poison, the reason he had died without knowing how or why. He reflected on how the platoon commander, Vengeance, had already been killed, and the killer was now preparing to stab Krang. Encrid watched helplessly as the assassin killed Krang right before his eyes. Another assassin arrived, and after a while, Encrid recognized her as the lady he had suspected. That morning, a man was playing an instrument and asking who the hero of the battlefield was. Others responded that it was Cypress. Encrid thought it was the same morning repeating for the third time in a row. He remained on high alert but couldn't even detect the assassin's presence, realizing that it wouldn't be easy to confront the company commander. Even if he managed to stop the assassins, he would have to face the company commander right after feeling so helpless. He remembered feeling the same way a few days ago but managed to overcome it. He was determined to find a way to succeed as long as he didn't give up. With the sword in his hand, he pulled the cloth off the boy, who asked why Encrid was acting so strangely. Encrid realized he might have been mistaken in assuming the assassins had already infiltrated the base and decided he needed to be cautious about threats from outside. The boy asked if Encrid's training that day involved catching cockroaches with a sword and remarked that it seemed fitting for lowly soldiers. Encrid replied that he was surprised the boy cared so much about his actions. The boy replied that he was being sarcastic, and Encrid suspected the same. The boy told Encrid to leave him alone, saying he didn't want to see Encrid's face. Krang approached and asked if they were arguing and if he should come back later. Encrid invited Krang to stay, saying it was fine. The boy lay back on the bed, referring to Encrid as an annoying person. Encrid considered that since the assassins were so observant of him, Krang was likely their target. Although he was somewhat suspicious, he wondered about Krang's true identity. Encrid wasn't going to pry into something the opponent wasn't willing to share without asking, just like the others who were lying there. He thought it was reasonable to ask, given his involvement in the assassination attempt. Encrid asked Krang what he was, but Krang did not respond. Encrid wondered if he had phrased the question incorrectly. Perhaps his conversational skills were lacking. Krang finally spoke, saying he wouldn't disclose something like that. Encrid asked why not, and Krang replied that it was a long story. Encrid agreed with Krang's response. The boy then asked Encrid if he was joking and if he was too gloomy to accept such an answer, suggesting that he shouldn't have asked the question. He noted that Krang definitely wasn't from that country, given his manners, and pressed Krang to honestly reveal which country's spy he was. Krang simply stared at the boy, making him uneasy. Krang moved closer to the boy and assured him that he had not and would not betray the kingdom. Encrid observed Krang's eyes and movements and sensed an aura similar to that of a knight. The boy recoiled slightly, questioning how Krang could act that way towards his senior. Krang laughed at this. Encrid considered that Krang might not be a knight, as he seemed powerless against the assassin, but he was certainly hiding something. As night fell, Encrid and the boy exchanged goodnight wishes and went to sleep. Encrid wondered if the boy was still scared of Krang after their earlier interaction. He thought about how, if assassins were to barge in, they would all be in danger. Encrid got up to investigate, and the boy, seeing him awake, asked what he was doing instead of sleeping. Encrid replied that the assassins would invade soon and urged the boy to cooperate if he wanted to survive. The boy didn't understand and told Encrid that he must have lost his mind before turning back to sleep. Encrid noticed Krang's peaceful, smiling face as he slept and thought it was just as he expected. Suddenly, assassins attacked, targeting Encrid's neck. The boy woke up to find himself under attack as well. Encrid saw that Krang had been killed too. The same morning repeated once more. A man was playing an instrument and asking who the hero of the battlefield was. Others answered that it was Cypress. Encrid realized it was the same morning for the fourth time. With no evidence of the assassin's approach and unable to get help from Vengeance and Krang, he decided to inform the higher-ups to request reinforcements. However, when he spoke to one of the higher-ups, the person became angry and told Encrid to be quiet or he would ensure Encrid would be silent for the rest of his life. Encrid ignored the higher-up's angry response. That night, he stayed on guard, hoping to predict the moment the assassins would appear and scream for help just before they did. He wondered if the attack would come now. Suddenly, an arrow struck his neck, aiming to kill him. He realized how fast the assassins were and knew there was no chance to get help from the others. He resolved to ambush them and defeat them before they could make their move. That same night, while on watch again, he was attacked once more. He wondered how he could fight back when he couldn't even see his attackers. They seemed to see everything, while he struggled to avoid their poison needles. Without the ability to counter their attacks, he faced certain death. The day repeated. A man played an instrument and asked who the hero of the battlefield was, and others answered that it was Cyprus. Encrid realized it was the same morning for the 20th time. He was helpless and had achieved nothing for the 20th consecutive day. Encrid realized that he had died 20 times and needed to find a way to avoid the poison needles before considering how to deal with the assassins. He needed a method to evade their attacks faster than they could see. He then saw Jackson and remembered Rem's comment about Jackson being referred to as a perverted wildcat. Encrid asked Rem why he had called Jackson that. Rem replied that it was because Jackson was a dirty pervert who never confronted his enemies directly but preferred backstabbing and running away. Rem remarked that this behavior resembled a cunning and perverted wildcat. When Encrid met Jackson, Jackson inquired about his injuries. Encrid assumed that Jackson would easily handle the assassins, but he couldn't simply take Jackson with him due to a lack of authority. Even if he could, it was a challenge he needed to overcome on his own. He needed to become like Jackson in his cunning. Encrid asked Jackson what he would do if someone like him were to stab Encrid in the back. Jackson thought for a moment and replied that he wasn't sure no one had ever survived his ambushes. After a while, Jacob said that Encrid would need eyes in the back of his head. Encrid didn't understand, so he asked for clarification. Jackson explained the importance of perfect timing and then asked if Encrid had seen the wagon. Encrid wondered where the wagon was. Jackson told him it was behind the tent. When Encrid saw it, he marveled at how Jackson had noticed something so far away and wondered if he really had eyes in the back of his head. Jackson explained that the wagon was about to fall apart. When it happened, Encrid was astonished and asked if Jackson was a prophet. Jackson mentioned that it seemed Encrid had spent too much time with that barbarian. Encrid asked Jackson not to joke and insisted on knowing how he had predicted the wagon's collapse. Jackson replied that he had heard the creaking of the wagon's axle and noted that if Encrid paid attention to the sounds around him, he could predict what might happen next. Encrid was shocked that Jackson had heard something so faint as he hadn't even noticed the wagon approaching. Jackson explained that they didn't need to see to sense what was around them and encouraged Encrid to keep practicing his listening skills. He emphasized that improving one's senses and interpreting sounds could greatly enhance their awareness. Encrid remarked that it was a good explanation, though he seemed too lazy to respond properly. Jackson admitted that he had been lazy, but he preferred that to having Encrid constantly on his heels. Nowadays, it seemed Encrid wasn't going to give up. At night, Encrid lay in bed, reflecting on how he had come across a new obstacle in the form of faceless death. He realized that survival depended on his ability to sense danger. He heard the regular footsteps of the patrol, the sound of torches, and then some unusual noises. Suddenly, a poisonous needle struck at him, aiming to kill. He thought he had failed again and felt as if he had made no progress, though his body retained the lessons learned, the experience of understanding the heart of the beast and the sting of the attack. Jackson told him that he could gain valuable information from sound alone. By assessing the intensity and direction of sounds, they could determine the location of something. Once they could detect faint, distant noises, their ears might as well become a second pair of eyes. Encrid snapped, declaring that sound was like a wave radiating in all directions, no matter how silent it might be. Amid the chaos of thousands of overlapping sound waves, he needed to isolate one single wave. He had heard others talking, which was why he had seized the boy's neck. Someone had asked if others had ever visited the town they were discussing, noting its beauty. Encrid focused on the sounds mixed within the entangled sound waves, realizing he needed to listen, categorize, and isolate them. The flags sounded like one large flag flapping in the wind. He wondered how many there were. He felt the sounds from right to left, 3 close by and 2 farther away. He sensed the waves and recognized both familiar and unfamiliar sounds. Krang approached and inquired about the type of training Encrid was undertaking. Krang even referred to Encrid by a different name. Encrid asked Krang what he wanted and questioned if Krang thought this was a form of training. Krang insisted that Encrid was no idiot and wouldn't waste his time. That night, Encrid was killed by the needle once more and saw Krang being stabbed by the sword again. Encrid thought that this was the 33rd day of failure. On the 34th day, he heard nothing again and continued to fail for several more days. Despite the setbacks, he kept practicing, convinced that he didn't need more experience to overcome this wall. Neither intervention nor sudden realization was necessary, he simply needed to persist in his efforts. While meditating, Encrid was surprised when Krang sneaked up on him. Encrid wondered how Krang had managed to approach him unnoticed. He had his eyes closed during the training to focus on improving his perception and was determined not to waste his time. That night, when Encrid was attacked, he managed to block the attack and strike back. He thought that the attacker was no longer the faceless death he had faced before. The man attacked with a sword, and Encrid quickly realized that the man was inexperienced in combat, stabbing erratically. Encrid felt confident he could handle him. He then noticed that the vengeful assassin was already dead, and Krang had woken up to block the attacks. Encrid reminded himself not to let his guard down, as the man was still a skilled assassin. The man continued to assault Encrid with the sword, but Encrid skillfully dodged every strike. He spotted the fairy commander and thought that if he didn't strike first, he would die. Another assassin attacked Encrid and Krang from behind, but the lady intervened, pushing Encrid aside and taking the needles on her own cloak. She also protected Krang. Encrid initially thought she was an ally of the assassins, but soon realized she was defending both him and Krang. Seizing the opportunity, Encrid attempted to attack one of the assassins, but the assassin blocked his move and tried to flee. Krang commented that the assassin was clearly targeting him. Encrid agreed and added that it was obvious. When Krang asked how he knew, Encrid pointed out that no one would pay an assassin to kill someone like him if it wasn't for vengeance. The lady concurred, noting how fast Encrid was. Encrid had initially believed the lady was an ally, but now it seemed she was determined to keep her presence a secret and ensure there were no witnesses. Krang told her he had a favor to ask. He didn't want anyone to die that day. The lady bowed in agreement. Krang added that this favor extended to the platoon commander, who was still alive. The lady mentioned they had an antidote, so the platoon commander should be fine. Encrid realized that the lady must also possess knowledge of antidotes. Krang explained that they needed to clean up the mess, as it would be problematic if people discovered an assassin had been there. Encrid asked if it would be acceptable as long as there were no traces left and if there was an easy way to handle it. They decided to set fire to the medical tent, with Encrid and the boy being the only survivors from that location. Others rushed to the scene to put out the fire. Encrid thought that this would erase any traces of the assassin and they would deal with the aftermath. Meanwhile, those who had arrived were throwing water on the tent to extinguish the flames. The lady and Krang walked through the forest. She remarked that if the squad leader hadn't slowed him down, Krang would have died, and she asked if Krang had changed his mind about Encrid because of this. Krang agreed, noting that Encrid was indeed interesting. Krang thought he had been avoiding this situation. He then told Encrid that he must have rubbed off on him and suggested they meet again in their respective roles. Encrid found himself in a very dark place where a man told him he would surely encounter that person again. Encrid tried to push away the thoughts, reflecting on how he had been confronted by the same scenario repeatedly that day. He had survived against the silent death and woke up to the next morning. Encrid could sense the presence of most things, but he couldn't detect the fairy. He had a lot to do once he returned and was grateful not to be injured so he could go back immediately. The boy asked Encrid why he had saved him from the fire. Encrid wondered if the boy even cared about being saved and why he seemed to dislike him. Encrid replied that he saved the boy because they were comrades and asked if the boy wanted another reason. The boy responded that, despite everything that had happened, Encrid still acted in that way. He then asked if Encrid was returning to his squad. When Encrid agreed, the boy remarked that Encrid was out of luck and that the situation would be grim there. Encrid asked if something had happened. The boy replied that there was a rumor circulating that the entire base was cursed. Ranga began to push Rem, referring to him as an underdeveloped monkey. Rem, enraged, lifted Ranga and prepared to throw him. The others were shocked and started running away as the two began fighting again. Someone wondered where the squad leader of the two was, noting that their absence seemed to have contributed to the chaos. Rem threw Ranga into a tent, causing a mess. As someone commented on the tense condition, others advised not to approach the two, fearing they might get caught in the crossfire. Rem declared that he would decorate Ranga's skull with his axe, shocking everyone further. In response, Ranga drew his sword, intensifying the situation. The onlookers were bewildered, wondering where the squad mates of these two were. Encrid observed the scene, thinking that he didn't know if the base was cursed, but these two might well be a curse in themselves. He shouted at them to stop. Shocked, they asked when Encrid had arrived. The second one remarked that he thought Encrid was already dead. Encrid replied that he hadn't died and might actually go crazy because of the two of them. After everything, 4 days passed before Encrid returned to his squad. As he opened his eyes, he saw Jackson standing there. Jackson mentioned that he had been trying to leave quietly and asked if he had woken Encrid. Encrid denied it and said he was about to wake up to work out. Jackson noted that while Encrid had only recently started, he was already very good at listening. Encrid replied that he had been practicing. Jackson encouraged him to keep practicing, as it would help him someday. Encrid thought that battles were infrequent, and with the winter approaching, he needed to make the most of all the extra time to train. When he returned from his training, Auden greeted him. Encrid noticed that Auden was doing push-ups with a giant rock on his back. Auden asked Encrid if he was returning from his morning workouts. He commented that keeping busy with training was good, as a well-trained body was a weapon in itself. Auden added that Encrid should be able to withstand a kick from a frog and noted that he was still too thin, so he needed to continue training. Encrid wondered if Auden was just excessively large, but he agreed to try. Auden then began discussing the training techniques he had mentioned to Encrid before. The scene shifts to Rem and Ranga, who are still engaged in their fight. Rem tells Ranga that it's his turn for duty, but Ranga is still asleep. Ranga grabs his sword and rushes to attack Rem. Just then, Encrid and Auden arrive and ask if the two have started fighting again. Encrid requests that they stop. Auden remarks that wanton violence solves nothing. Rem responds that Ranga was supposed to handle their meals. Encrid tells Ranga that if it's his turn off duty, he should go and cook. Ranga agrees, as Encrid suggested. Rem adds that there was no need for all this if Ranga was going to do his duty and hands him a cloth. Ranga pushes the cloth back, complaining that it smells bad. However, when Rem smells the cloth, he remarks that it actually smells fine. Encrid asks Rem to stop picking fights for no reason and wonders if Rem is bored. Rem admits that the lack of battles is making him restless. Encrid suggests that instead of fighting random people, Rem should battle him in a duel. The two agree, and their duel begins. As they fight, Encrid focuses on keeping himself cool by drawing on the heart of the beast and using his hearing to block the hits. He applies everything he has practiced while dying hundreds of times. Rem attacked Encrid again, but Encrid countered with his sword. Rem dodged the attack and prepared to use his weapon, forcing Encrid to halt his swing. Rem grabbed Encrid by the collar, pinning him down, and expressed his disappointment. He expected more from Encrid, who had improved so much recently. Rem asked why Encrid had become so boring and why his same old stab was already starting to bore him. He challenged Encrid to show him something new. Encrid reflected on how he had changed from before and realized he could repeat things many times to progress. He asked Rem to come at him again, promising that he would properly defeat him this time. Rem noted that while Encrid's skills were still lacking, he was not yet tired of the challenge, especially seeing the determination in Encrid's eyes. Rem said that Encrid could make that claim only after he left a dent on him. Just then, it started to rain, prompting them to pause the duel and seek shelter in a tent. Encrid observed that the rain seemed to start and stop at will. Rem was cleaning his legs and remarked that if it continued like this, mushrooms might start growing on his feet. Craze entered from outside, wondering how many times they would have to change their duels because of the rain. He joked that he would believe it if someone said they were cursed. Encrid asked about the curse. Craze inquired if Encrid hadn't heard the rumors. Encrid remembered that Vengeance had mentioned something similar. Craze explained that the weather had been odd, casualties had increased, and there had been incidents of people getting set on fire. This was particularly true for the scout squad. Jack, Bo, Rotten, and others had all been hurt. People were saying they were cursed because of all this, though Craze was sure it wasn't a real curse. He believed the erratic weather had only fueled the rumors. Encrid mentioned that the higher-ups wouldn't let something like that go unnoticed. Craze then asked why Encrid was standing at the entrance of the tent. Encrid replied that he was training his senses. Craze asked if he was doing that in the downpour. Encrid confirmed it was due to the rain. Rem teased, asking if Encrid was acting like a stray cat and questioned the benefit of such training. Jackson interjected, saying that it wasn't a bad way to train and that Encrid was doing well. Rem asked Jackson what he had taught and since when he cared about their squad leader. When Jackson didn't respond, Rem grew angry at being ignored again. Encrid thought it was so noisy in there that he couldn't even hear the rain. Auden told Encrid that if he was looking for a way to train in the tent, there were exercises he could do even while lying down. Ranga asked if Encrid wanted him to check his stance again. Rem thought that everyone had noticed what he had as well. The scene shifts to a different tent where a meeting was taking place. A man addressed the company commanders, instructing them to keep their soldiers in check and to send out a scouting party before winter. He asked if anyone had suggestions to address the gaps in their plans. The fairy lady inquired about the 444th squad leader. The man replied dismissively, saying the boy was useless and might hinder the scouts. The lady argued that Encrid could bring unexpected results. When asked why she believed that, she responded that it was a fairy's instinct. The next day, Encrid met with the lady and asked if he was being sent to the scouts.